This is the story of Arachne. Arachne was a maiden who became famous throughout Greece.
Though she was neither well-born nor beautiful and lived in no great city,
she lived in an obscure little village.
And her father was a humble dryer of wool. In this he was very skillful, producing many varied shades.
Although above all, he was famous for the clear bright scarlet which is made from shellfish.
And which was the most glorious of all the colors used in ancient Greece.
Even more skillful than her father was Arachne.
It was her task to spin the fleecy wool into a fine soft thread and loom it into cloth on a high-standing loom within the cottage.
Arachne was small and pale from much working, yet she was quick and graceful, and her figures went so fast that it was hard to follow their flickering movements.
So soft and even was her thread, so fine her cloth, so beautiful and embroidered, that soon her products were known all over Greece.
At last, Arachne's fame became so great that people used to come from far and wide to watch her working.
Surely Athena herself must have taught her people would learn to one another.
Who else could know the secret of such marvelous skill?
Arachne was used to being wondered at.
And she was immensely proud of the skill that had brought so many to look at her. Praise was all she lived for, and it displeased her to think anyone, even a goddess, could teach her anything.
Therefore, when she heard the murmur, she would stop her work and turn around indignantly and say,
"With my own fingers I gained the skill, and by hard practice. I never had time to stand looking as you people do while another maiden worked. Nor if I had would I give Athena credit because the girl was more skillful than I. As for Athena's weaving, how could there be finer cloth or more beautiful embroidery than mine? If Athena herself were to come down here and compete with me, she would do no better than I."
An old woman answered her, a gray old woman, bent and very poor,
Who stood leaning on a staff, peering at Arachne amid the crowd of onlookers.
"It appears someone has stolen my line."
"So sorry I stole your lines, but I shall proceed now." "Reckless girl," she said, "how dare you claim to be equal to the immortal gods himself? I am an old woman, and have seen very much. Take my advice, ask pardon of your words from Athena. Rest content with your fame of being the best spinner and weaver mortal eyes have ever beheld."
"Stupid old woman," said Arachne indignantly. "Who gave you a right to speak in this way to me? It is easy to you, too, that you were never good at anything in our day, or you would not come here in poverty and rags to gaze at my skill. If Athena resents my words, let her answer them herself. I have challenged her to a contest, but she, of course, will not come. It is easy for the gods to avoid matching their skill with that of men."
At these words, the old woman threw down her staff and stood erect.
The wondering onlookers saw her grow tall, fair, and stand cloth, with long robes of dazzling white.
They were terribly afraid as they realized they stood in the presence of Athena.
Arachne herself flushed for a moment, for she had never really believed that the goddess would hear her.
Before the group that was gathered there, she would not give in.
So pressing on her pale lips together in obstinacy and pride, she led the goddess to one of the great looms and set herself before.
Without a word, both began to thread the long woolen strands that hung from the rollers, and which between the shuttle moves back and forth.
Soon there was no sound in the room but the breathing of the onlookers.
The whirling of shuttles.
And the creaking of the wooden frames as each pressed the thread up into place.
The excited crowd in the doorway began to see that the skill of both in truth was very nearly equal.
Now stare at each other.
The man had the clock might turn up, however, the goddess was the quicker too.
A pattern of pictures was growing on her loom, a border of twined olive branches, Athena's favorite tree.
In the middle, a figure began to appear.
As they looked at the glowing colors, the spectators realized that Athena was weaving into her pattern a last warning to Arachne.
The central figure was the goddess herself competing with Poseidon for the city of Athens. But in the four corners were mortals who had tried to strive with gods and pictures of the awful fate that had overtaken them.
The goddess ended a little bit before Arachne and stood back from her marvelous work to see what the maiden was doing.
Never before had Arachne been matched against someone whose skill was equal, or even nearly equal to her own.
As she stole glances from time to time at Athena and saw the goddess working swiftly and calmly and always a little faster than herself, she became angry instead of frightened, and an evil thought came into her head.
Thus, as Athena stepped back a pace to watch Arachne finishing her work, she saw that the maiden had taken for her design scenes, which showed evil or unworthy actions of the gods.
How they had deceived fair maidens.
And how they had resorted to trickery and appeared on earth from time to time in the form of poor and humble people.
When the goddess saw the insults glowing in bright colors on Arachne's loom, she did not wait.
She stepped forward, her gray eyes blazing, and tore Arachne's work across, and she struck Arachne across the face.
Arachne stood there in a moment, struggling with anger, fear, and pride. "I will not live under this insult," she cried.
Seizing a rope from the wall, she made a noose and would have hanged herself.
The goddess touched the rope, and then touched the maiden. "Live on," she said. "Live on, wicked girl. Live on and thin, both you and your descendants. When men look at you, they may remember it's not wise to strive with Athena."
At that, the body of Arachne had shriveled up. Her legs grew tiny, spindled, and distorted.
There, before the eyes of the spectators, the little dusty brown spider on a slender thread.
All spiders descend from Arachne.